Okay, good evening, all of you. Thank you very much for joining in. On behalf of the organizing committee of Typography Society of India, I would like to welcome all of you. Uh, this is the eighth session of online lecture series after we did our formal inauguration on the 15th of August. We had a lot of interesting talks, and today we have two very important typographers. I am very happy to introduce all of you to Arvind Patel. So, he will be taking this forward. And Eiichi Kono is a renowned Japanese typographer. We have two great typography legends with us today. It's a very proud moment for the Typography Society of India. So they will be talking about font design through the ages, a look at the pre and post digital era of font design processes. And as we start, I will introduce you to Mr. Arvind Patel. Arvind Patel strayed into the captivating world of typography during a publishing project during his student days at Harvard Business School. This led him to quit business school to study design. In hindsight, he concedes this would not have been possible without the sense of untested confidence that plagued many a business school student. In 1982, he joined India Today in Delhi and led the process of revising its design while helping a technical team to implement ATEX, the first magazine pagination system in India. The design and visual appeal that made India Today stand apart from its competitors was largely enabled by the technology supporting its production. India Today's success earned him an offer from The Economist in London. He served as the paper's design director from 87 to 99, straddling his passion for both design and technology. In 1990, he designed Ecotype, a family of text faces in a joint project with Gunlangur Brahim. This was one of the most notable typefaces which is customized for a particular news publication. This family of text faces now used by the paper. The two also went on to design Times Millennium, a digital avatar of the eponymous Times Roman for the Times newspaper in London. Back in India since 2000, Arvind recently redesigned the Hindu newspaper. He has worked on a lot of important projects in India. He was felicitated with the Lifetime Achievement Award in Typography Day in 2014. So, on behalf of the Typography Society of India, I extend a warm welcome to Mr. Arvind Patel. Over to you.
Your screen, correct.
Yeah.
So let me begin. So I'm here to introduce a highly accomplished typographer, but he also happens to be a friend. So I'm going to be in many ways unabashedly biased, and I hope I don't come across as that. Anyway, this is to introduce Eiichi Kono, whose own country has called him a cultural icon, an ambassador. For various reasons, because he left Japan at a very young age. But next slide, please. Can you hear me? Yeah. Now, this is not to blow anyone's minds, but in 1945, when the Hiroshima bomb went off, our speaker this evening, Eiichi Kono, was 4 years old, and he survived the first attack, which was about 1,200 kilometers from his home in Tokyo. The second attack, which happened on the 9th of August, 1945, was about 800 kilometers. I think over about 355,000 people died. Fortunately, he survived. So here we have, because of that lucky accident, that he survived. We are now fortunate to have him speak for us this evening. Next, please. Yeah, so Eiichi basically was a very studious student, went on to finish school, and then he joined Carl Zeiss in Japan, a German company which was involved in optics. And this involvement in optics probably helped him later in life when he got involved with typography, because he was very familiar with technology at some level, and also about ways of seeing, seeing at a very microscopic level. Uh, and the one thing he noticed working for Carl Zeiss is that all the Japanese literature, he was working first in the publicity department, just didn't look right to him, anything set in Japanese. So he wondered why that was. And everything he saw set in German looked perfectly like a DIN standard. Everything looked just right. And he wanted to be able to do that for his language, but he didn't know how to go about doing it. But he had an instinct that something needed doing. So after years of working at this company, next slide, please, he decided to leave Japan in 1974, not being very fluent in English, and moved to England to study printing, because he felt that was one way for him to figure out how to improve stuff in print. And while in England, he studied English, became very proficient at it, and he spent 4 years at London School of Printing, where he was steeped in the learning of typography. And among the first things he discovered when he was hoping to encounter an Englishman as his teacher turned out to be a man called Trilokesh Mukherjee, who is seen here on the top right in a circle. Trilo Mukherjee was an outstanding teacher, continues to be, though he's retired, and he's the man responsible for putting Eiichi and me together. Trilo was a friend of mine, and when I first moved to England to work for The Economist, he said, you have to meet one of my students who's now a very accomplished designer called Eiichi Kono, and that's how we met. So people who say that we Indians are separated not by 6, but 2 degrees were absolutely right. And to that, I had Japanese friend Eiichi as part of our Indian family, because we all came together because of an Indian who happened to be his teacher. So having finished London's College of Printing, next slide, please, Eiichi went on to join the Royal College of Art, from where he got a master's degree, and he graduated in 1979. And among the various things he did for his thesis was a study of Edward Johnston's sans serif typefaces, which was great because, next slide, please. On the strength of that, he got employed by a company called Banks and Miles, at the time a very prominent English design company that had just landed itself a very, very interesting assignment to redesign the London Underground typeface, which was originally designed, next slide, please, by Edward Johnston. And it was designed largely for display. And this was, Edward Johnston was as many of you may know, a fine calligrapher who was responsible for the revival of writing, illuminating, and the teaching of calligraphy in England, which then went on to influence various type designers, early among them Eric Gill, and so on. So, including Rudolf Koch in Germany. So Edward Johnston in many ways is like the father of the revival of typography. And when he worked on the London Underground typeface, um, he basically wanted something that was very robust, built on classical proportions, but easy enough for draftsmen and sign painters to render, because pre-production technologies weren't as easy as they are now today. So various people had to hand letter it. So it was a letter form that could be constructed easily. And then it went on to extend its application across various things. Having started as a display font, it went on to become a very good text font and so on, used for signage, among other things, and also for the London Underground maps and so on. Next slide, please. So then Eiichi, having studied Edward Johnston, was best suited to take on this task because it needed a grounding in understanding the roots of where the London typeface came from, the underground typeface came from, and also an appreciation of a rigorous methodology which he had, having studied at the Royal College and being a very skilled craftsman. What you're seeing before you is a letter, a fictitious letter he wrote to Edward Johnston, which was published in a British publication in 2013, sharing how he came about to work on the revival of his typeface, which had outgrown its utility uh, as a metal typeface and as a display typeface that was first done in large wooden blocks and so on for use in modern technology. And this was the task his employers at the time, Banks and Miles, had picked up, but they had no one to give the task to because it was such a daunting task. So Aiichi was given this job and he spent lots of time studying it. And among the things he learned was that this was an extremely utilitarian font. It was designed for a specific purpose, which had kind of outlived its utility in terms of reproduction, had changed from metal to phototype setting. And so London Underground wasn't able to make the transition. And the job for Banks and Miles and Aiichi was to be able to make that transition a smooth one. And so they had to redo the entire typeface, which at the time existed in two weights, regular and bold. So what Aiichi did was he basically said, let's build the regular as the light. Let's do an intermediate weight, which is a medium, and then do another weight, which is a bold. And so he redrew everything. And that became the basis of the revival of the new Johnston. Next slide, please. Uh, so that was his first kind of foray into a rigorous typographic exercise to take something that is deeply traditional as typeface design is. I mean, we all design typefaces and fonts and so on, but we realize that you can't have a completely unique shape because then it's no longer understandable. So we have to respect tradition, but within that tradition, we need to understand the technology that's being used to render that form at any given time and how best to design that form for that technology. And, and so that was the kind of thing he started focusing on. Having done the London Underground, the next task he had was to look at the telephone directory typefaces. Most of us use, well, all of us now use mobile phones. And with mobile phones, no one even knows what a telephone directory is. London at its height had four different volumes for its phone directories. There were like 24 million copies in print. There were 6 million subscribers, telephone subscribers in England. Uh, in total, 27,000 tons of paper was consumed in the production of these directories. So it was an extremely wasteful exercise. And the task that Aiichi took on was to say, okay, how can we use typography to kind of conserve space, improve legibility, and save paper? And so he started work on the design of the London Underground, London telephone directory typeface. Next slide, please. And this was an extremely rigorous study. You can see there were all these beautifully hand-lettered notes on top, different settings, a lot of it pasted by hand, just to do comparisons between leading and so on, until he arrived at some consensus on what to use. What is interesting is that, next slide, please. When he came up with a final solution, it wasn't just the design of the typeface. He looked at everything and the way the type directory was being set. And he says, you know what? If we have a last name like McDonald, we don't have to repeat it on every line. So let's have it on top of the page. And then we'll have a little lead-in marker and then the person's initial. So this way we conserve space. So it was both a very sensible design solution as well as an outstanding typographic solution. So effectively, he was able to compress more text by increasing the X side, reducing the ascenders, descenders, so you could get more names per column. Instead of 3 columns, he set everything in 4 columns by getting rid of the last name and so on. He was able to conserve space. And this whole exercise in its first printing saved something in the order of about 6 million pounds in paper costs. Next slide, please. Now, to give you a background, at the time Eiichi did all this, everything had to be done by hand. So these were the kind of tools he was using. Everything was drawn by hand. He had a scalpel with which to scrape things to get just the right proportions. He had a special viewing magnifying glass. These are the camera you're seeing at the bottom right-hand corner. It's called a stat camera, which was used to make large prints of each character. So you could touch it up and do things to it that you couldn't by hand and so on. But this was a very time-consuming, tedious process. And he did all this. Every letter, every weight was done by hand. Next slide, please. So now I'm just going to run through 2 or 3 slides to show you the process he went when he was doing this. This is out of the London Underground typeface, all done by hand. And see how much work you had to do. Done on graph paper, everything's rendered by hand. Next, please. Next. Again, see tracing of every character, then notes everywhere, what kind of compensations to make, what kind of things to do. Next slide, please. Again, deep notes on proportions, weights, stem width. So again, it's the drawing, it's the understanding of each form by doing it by hand. So it's not as simple as just sitting on a computer, having Bezier curves and knocking it out, which of course, in the hands of skilled people produces great stuff. But the rigor and the discipline you get doing stuff by hand is a whole different feeling. And he's been through that. So in that sense, he's kind of a Zen master when it comes to looking at letter forms and rendering them by hand. Next slide, please. Having outlined everything, you then go and fill everything by hand. So you do this for every letter and it's done very clean. Next slide, please. Now here you'll see like little nicks at where the terminals and the stems meet. These were ink compensation marks, which had to be digitized in order to make sure that when the letter was printed, they didn't get blurred. Next slide, please. So the Johnston typeface, which he started as an exercise for Johnston, for the London Underground, became like a lifelong passion for him. And he continued to pursue it in his own time, largely with a view to kind of refining it constantly for himself and using the new tools. By now, he was using Photographer, he was familiar with the computer. So having started something by hand years ago, he continued working on it. And here this example shows you the first B on the left was the original. Then the new Johnston, which he started working on. Basically, he's just increasing the size, the X heights of the characters. And just the widths, if you see the proportions, the stems and everything, it's just being tweaked. You look at the lowercase I, by just increasing the X height, see how much bigger it is for the same ascender height. Likewise, the G, which is on the extreme right, see how much bigger it appears by reducing the descenders. So this is an exercise he's continued to do. And next slide, please. So having done a lot of work in the Latin scripts, the ambassador, as this country referred to him, a cultural ambassador, decided in 2002, between 2002 and 2008, to start working on a Japanese font. But it wasn't just plain simple work, because his main gripe with Japanese fonts was, one, they looked very crowded oftentimes because it's a very complex form. But when combined with the Latin alphabet, which is often done in Japan, because quite often words are put in English with the Japanese text, they just looked horrible together. And numerals especially just looked terrible. So this was a task he had set for himself. He had some very clear ideas, and quite fortunately for him, a very interesting man called Robert Norton was head of the typographic development at Microsoft. He was an old Englishman, a common friend to all of us. And Robert, realizing that one of the things that was holding up the sale of Windows in Japan, Microsoft Windows in Japan, was the fact that it had a very poor Japanese font. And he felt that if they improved that font, it would really benefit the sales of Microsoft Windows in Japan. And so he brought in Eiichi to work on this humongous exercise. And it was really like a multinational, transnational exercise with many people working all over the place, including China and Taiwan and so on. And Eiichi was like the grand architect of the whole thing because he had the vision. And he collaborated with various people to do this, among them Matthew Carter. Okay, next slide, please. So this on the left is what Microsoft Windows had before, and just see how terrible it looks. And especially the Latin script. See the word legibility, the word character. On the right is Mario, which is the typeface Eiichi did with the Latin done by Matthew Carter, who he worked with in and you can see the result speaks for itself. And among other things, this went on to help the sale of Windows, Microsoft Windows in Japan big time. And Aichi got a lot of kudos all over the place for this. And it was a enormous work, enormous effort, and it really delivered. So again, basically, it's a combination of being able to see letter forms, what they do, and making them do what they do in the best way possible. And if there was ever a person at that point of time in history, and it's that right confluence of time and event, and he just happened to be there at the right time because he understood Japanese typography immaculately, he understood Latin typography immaculately. He happened to know the man who headed type development at Microsoft. He happened to be a friend of Matthew Carter, who had done a lot of work for Microsoft. So it was a collaboration of great minds, great skills that produced this. And I think we all benefited from it enormously. It won an award in 2007 for good design. Next slide, please. On the top, you see Aichi's letter forms. You see the large X height and what it's doing for certainly the Latin forms. That's Matthew Carter's work. You see what Gothic was doing before, and you see when the two combine, how much darker the original MS Gothic in Windows 95 was, and how much more open the Good Design Award-winning Mario was. So all in all, a very successful typeface that was able to combine both things, both letter forms, Latin and Japanese. Next slide, please. And here's his collaborator, Matthew Carter. Next slide, please. Among the other collaborators that Aichi had was a very, very, very distinguished letter carver called this was Mr. Kindersley, David Kindersley, very famous man. David ran a fantastic studio, and he was a student of Eric Gill. He learned stone carving from Eric Gill. So now if you look at lineage, Eric Gill studied under under Edward Johnston. So you can see this lineage and it continues. And Aichi was able to work with both Lida, who married David Kindersley. And the thing with letter carvers in stone is they have a very, very acute sense of letter spacing because they are working in stone. They're looking at every letter as it stands next to another letter. And spacing ultimately is how you're able to look at what is before and after each character, because that is what defines good spacing. And letter carvers have that innate sense of being able to space things very well. Admittedly, they work on a very large scale, but what they're able to do with spacing, most people on computers can't ever even imagine doing. So David, with all that kind of a background, had various ideas about optical spacing. And he collaborated with some engineers at Cambridge. Next slide, please. And basically, his whole thing was that you have to measure the optical density of every character and then see it relative to the optical density of every character before and after. And that should kind of allow how you space things. And so Aichi was able to work with them and apply some of these principles in some Japanese fonts he worked with. So effectively, again, a great confluence of time and event. You meet people with this immaculate lineage, great tradition, who all collaborate and do amazing things using technology and take typography to the next level. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide to introduce Aichi, which is, this is from I'm Imprint, a private press. Again, they're doing this beautiful hand-set typographic poster using Johnston Sands. And it's a typographic gem of purity and intellectual honesty, as they refer to Johnston Sands, because it was ultimately a very utilitarian, humane, functional typeface. Okay, next slide, please.